Testament quiz, I was going to print off the answers. And I'll still do that for review for the test. But for the quiz, I thought we'd go over it real quick and let you write them down, because if you write it down, you tend to remember it better. But for time's sake, I won't do that for the review for the test, which I will bring next week. So, 5-question quiz for next week. Again, there's 5 questions and 5 references, so that's 100 points. However, there's actually 7 references, so you can get, you have I'll count from 0 up, so each one's worth 10, so you have 12 opportunities to get 10 right. Okay, so the first one, see if anybody can answer real quick and just holler out the answer. How many clean animals are of each kind are brought onto the ark?
7.
7.
8.
7 of each. 7 of each. Okay. And anybody have a reference for that?
Genesis 7, 2, and 3.
Wow. Yes, Genesis 7, 2, and 3. Sorry, I didn't mean to be shocked. I just. Wow. Actually. My apologies. How many unclean animals of each kind?
2.
Okay, 2 is there a reference, and I won't be shocked when someone gives it to me.
Same reference.
Same reference. I'm going to give you another one, just to give you another opportunity to excel. Genesis 6, 18 to 20. So I owe it to you to confess that last week I had to look that up. So, Jonathan, last week I had to look up Genesis 7, 2, and 3. So. All right, did God allow capital punishment before the flood?
No.
No, okay. Anybody have a reference, even a chapter? Okay, why do you think that? Can you think of an example? You or anyone? Yeah. Put a mark on king, correct. Genesis 4, verse 15. When did God institute capital punishment? Or did he? What's that?
Was it with the 10 Commandments? No, because that's not.
Tower of Babel.
No, wrong one.
You're getting closer. The 10 Commandments are in Exodus 20, and in Exodus 21, capital punishment is there, but it's before then.
Like right after the flood.
Right after the flood. Genesis 9, verse 6. As soon as they got off the ark. And then, who were the sons of God in Genesis 6? Because in John 1, they're like us. Yeah. Sorry?
Was it the giants?
They were the fathers of the giants.
The fallen angels.
They were angels. They were fallen angels, yes. Job 30, I'll give you 3 references. So this is where the potential for bonus comes in. Job 38, verses 4 and 7. If you write 4 through 7, I'll give you either way. Which basically has sons of God shouting for joy when in the morning stars singing together when God created the heaven and the earth. So obviously it's not us. And then these 2 verses go together. Jude 6 with 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 to 6. Jude 6 with 2 Peter 2 4 to 6. It associates angels with those that were rebelled in the days of Noah. All right, so that'll be next week. And so there are other answers, there are other references, but if you want credit, give the references we just gave with those answers. Anybody have any questions on those answers? Okay.
What was the reference chapter verse for 3?
What's 3? Oh,
That one?
Genesis 4:15.
Genesis what?
4:15. And what happens is Cain kills Abel, and God puts a mark on him so that anybody finding him would not kill him. And that's because you are at an age where God is judging you according to your conscience. The law of God's written on your heart.
So the quiz is next week?
Yes, ma'am. And we will do that, we will do it the first class, anytime, whichever class has the quiz or test, we'll do that first. Okay? By popular demand and me not getting rocks thrown at me and all that. All right, so Genesis chapter 10. So with that in mind, we'll go to Old Testament survey class. And I may go a little over, and I'll make up for it in Life of Christ. So we left off, and we, just by very review, the last thing we talked about was after the flood, God wanted them to multiply, replenish the earth, be fruitful, and in Genesis 10, you have now, in verse 1, now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. And then you have, in verse 2, the sons of Japheth and their descendants for a little while. And then in verse 6, the sons of Ham, you have Cush, which is the old name for Ethiopia. You have Mizraim, which is the old name for Egypt. In fact, on most maps around the world, it still says Mizraim. I think Egypt calls themselves Mizraim. Okay, they are the descendants of Mizraim. Put, I believe, is Libya, but I don't quote me on that. And then Canaan, and Canaan was the one who did not go down where he was supposed to. All right, and we'll see in a few minutes that Japheth was supposed to spread out toward the north, and the Shemites were supposed to go to the east of Israel, and then Israel, not at this time right at the Tower of Babel, but Israel is the land shortly after this that God gave to Abraham, and then Hamites were supposed to go to Africa. All right, and we'll see. We'll mainly concentrate on the Hamites on that because of Canaan. All right, Canaan not being in the land. We know the Canaanites caused the Jews all kinds of problems because when God gave them that land, the Canaanites are there. All right, we'll see that they're not supposed to be there. All right, so you have the four sons of Ham: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And then down in verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty hunter in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. Those are one of those things. You know, that's one of those things that that kind of cracked me up, like he kneeled upon his knees, and, you know, the widow woman, like, what was it, a widow dog? I mean, a widow is a woman, you know, those kind of things. But I know God has them in there for a reason, but they always mess with me. And this was one of those ones. You know, you see it a lot in Numbers, you know. But he said he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. We mentioned Shinar a little bit last week. That's the plains out in Babylon, out there in Iraq. This is where the Tower of Babel was. This is where Nebuchadnezzar set up the image for them to bow down when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow. And this is also where the image will be set up by the Antichrist, and if you don't worship the image of the beast, and you know, you get beheaded and all that stuff. Okay? And then verse 11, out of that land went forth Asher, That's where the Assyrians come from, Assur, and builded Nineveh, and the city Rehoboth and Calah and some other ones. All right, Nineveh is where God sent Jonah to preach. All right, became a mighty city during the time of Jonah. There were 120,000 people who were not old enough to tell their right from the left, according to the book of Jonah. And it was a 3 days journey, so it took 3 days to walk through the place. And so it became a mighty city. And out of that, he came out of Babel. All right. So we had the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. We looked at this a little bit last week. Man, ever since this Tower of Babel, and again we said the emphasis was on chapter 11, verse 3, let us make brick. Verse 4, go to let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So they didn't want to spread out. They wanted to rebel against God. And this is what man has been doing ever since. That's why you always have world empires. Number one, it's for power and for the leader and greed and all that. But man always wants to be unified, all the way down to the League of Nations, the United Nations. And it's going to be that way. Man will have that attitude until the return of Jesus Christ at the Battle of Armageddon. We saw Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 last week, that God divided them into, according to the number of the children of Israel. So he divides them into 12 nations. At the second covenant in Matthew 25, this is just kind of just to fill in, you're not going to be tested on this, but the nations are judged based on how they treat Israel during the tribulation. And the sheep nations get to go into the kingdom. All right? I personally believe there'll be 12, because this is how God had set it up. Plus, there are 12 gates in the city, and the nations are going to go each one to their own gate. All right? And some other reasons along that line. If you trace back, I'm certainly not a linguistic expert, and with being familiar with hundreds of languages or anything, but the people that do say that you can trace all languages back to 12 original languages, and they also say those 12 came from one. So not shocking, it's just kind of interesting, since that's what we're talking about. All right, and so that's where we left off. And in chapter 11, verse 11, you have verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. All right, and the end of verse 10, begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. All right. Verse 11, and Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. So they're still living a long time. The generations, each generation, the ages start to shrink pretty rapidly over the next 500 years. As you go down, Arphaxad had Selah, and Selah had Eber in verse 14. Eber is where you get the name Hebrew. So his descendants are Hebrews, and it became, over time, restricted to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to be Hebrews. But back at the time, Eber is where you get the name Hebrew. Just like Semitic, all those Semitic nations, people, anthropologists and everything, sometimes will talk about Semitic languages and so on. But yet, commonly, when people say Semitic or anti-Semitic, they're thinking of Jews. Right? It's the same idea. Okay. It's funny how history revolves around them, even though people say the Bible's not true, but it always revolves around them. Think about Jerusalem. All these people, say that, we were here first, Palestinians, all that stuff. And I know there were Palestinians like 3,000 years ago, and they've had that back and forth. But if you go back to before World War II, there was almost nobody living in what's today's Israel. There was some nomadic herdsmen and things like that. Most of the people that would live there were actually Jordanians. And then as soon as the Jews are going to go there, everybody pours into the place and says, we're Palestinians, Like, what's the Arafat, Yasser Arafat. He was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization for decades. He was an Egyptian. You know, well, you're in our land, you know, in our land of Palestine. He was an Egyptian, okay? But it's the same idea. So you go down through and you see in verse number 16, and Eber lived 430 years and begat Peleg. So we're going to look at Peleg for just briefly. And Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters, and Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. All right, so Peleg, a couple things about him. Look back at chapter 10, and he's listed in verse number 25. He is a Shemite. God stopped talking about the Hamites in verse 20 and gets to Shem in verse 21 and 22. In verse 23, you have the children of Aram, Uz. Job is from the land of Uz. And then verse 24, the end of the verse, you have Eber. And then unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg. His name means division, as you can see. So it says, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. All right, so, you know, it says they lived so many years and they begat this guy, and they lived so many years and begat that guy, and so on. If you follow that through from Shem down, Peleg is alive at the time of the Tower of Babel. Okay? So, the earth was divided by speech at the Tower of Babel, and by nationality, because God set the bounds of their habitations. So he put borders. But if you think about it, the natural borders are like North America, South America, Africa, Australia, things like that. Asia, Europe. And remember, back in Genesis 1, the earth was in one place. The seas, the waters were in one place. Therefore, by definition, if the waters were in one place, the land had to be in one place. So the earth's divided. So when God divided their languages, confused their languages, he further separated them by dividing the lands. Now, a lot of people will say it's only talking about the languages, except that what other time in there is there for all the continents to be divided? Plus, if you think about it, you're only a few hundred years after the flood. So you have the waters receding, and you have different things. But also, Peleg. In many languages, I don't know if it's all, but in many languages, the name Peleg is associated with a group of islands. When you have a group of islands, and I can say this correctly 3 times out of 5, but an archipelago. Okay, some people will say archipelago. Okay, what is an archipelago or an archipelago? It's a group of islands together, like the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, so whenever you have a group of islands, they call it an archipelago. Why? It goes back to here, where you have Earth. It basically means Earth is divided. So really, all over the world, people have this in their language, going back to Peleg. All right. So in Peleg's day, both the languages and the earth itself are divided up. You have one other account of this, 1 Chronicles 1. First Chronicles chapter number 1. And verse number 19. And it's going through those genealogies again. for like 9 chapters or something. And it says in verse 19, and unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, because in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. By the way, you know, I mentioned all those chapters in a row here. Maybe it's 8 chapters, something like that, in the beginning of First Chronicles. And if you read through it, there's things in there that you can't find anywhere else in Scripture that give you little keys. So that's like God rewards you for wading through it. But, you know, the Bible's a book of real life. And so just like real life has exciting things in it, you know, like the Yankees winning the World Series, or, you know, rappelling off a cliff, or, you know, whatever it is, going to see a new place that you've never seen, Niagara Falls or Hawaii or whatever. There are exciting things that happen, you know, your child being born, or, you know, you meet that person that you fall in love with, or whatever. But then there are boring things too, you know, like stuffed up commodes and leaky faucets, and, you know, life is, you know, flat tires at the wrong time. I don't know if there ever is a right time, but it seems like they're just always at the worst time. And so, you know, there are things that aren't that exciting in life too, and the Bible's that way. There are things like the parting of the Red Sea, and, you know, and turning water into blood, and all those kind of things. And then there are things like First Chronicles, and God puts them all in there for a reason. But you know, when you're reading the book of Esther, you know, one of the reasons God put this in here is to help you sleep. And you're reading the book of Esther, and the king of Persia can't sleep. So what does he do? He asks for the book of Chronicles. Now, it's not the Chronicles of the Hebrews, it's the Chronicles of the Persians. But what, you know, when he was suffering insomnia, he had him bring out the Chronicles, you know, so he could read it or have someone read it to him, because if that doesn't put you to sleep, nothing will. So, if you have one of those nights where you're tossing and turning, rather than turning to, you know, Benadryl and Salmonex and all that kind of stuff, take out First Chronicles and start reading, and you should be all set. So, God puts, you know, God has a sense of humor on this stuff. So the timing of this genealogies matches, and when you put that together with Deuteronomy and Acts 17, you find that the earth was divided both by nationality and by language, but also by land. All right. So back to Genesis chapter number 11. So this is the post-flood world, and it says, talking about Japheth, it says, by these were the nations of the earth divided. So then back in Genesis 11, down in verse 26, I mean, if you think about it, the first 11 chapters of Genesis go from Adam to something like 1,500 years later to the flood, to 500 years later to Abraham. And so those 11 chapters cover a couple thousand years, and then from Genesis 12 to Jesus Christ is another 2,000. So you get a kind of a condensed overview of, and you get the highlights of what's going on in those first couple thousand years. All right. So at the end of chapter 11, verse 26, you find a man named Terah. It's Abraham's father. And it says, and Terah lived 70 years, and he begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. You find that when you're reading, I think it's in Joshua, about Terah, and it says he worshiped the gods that were on the other side of the flood. And there are several times where that comes up, the other side of the flood. And you know, you go through and you look at it, and it's like, at least to me, it didn't make sense. How could all these things that God, there's several things where God says it was on the other side of the flood. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense, because it seems to have happened after the flood. And then I don't know why, but one day it hit me that I'm looking at it from my standpoint. From my standpoint, the other side of the flood was before Noah. In the Word of God, we're on the other side of the flood. The flood, God's talking about it from creation standpoint, from his side of the flood. After the flood is the other side of the flood. So Terah is worshiping those gods that show up on the other side of the flood, on his side, on this side of the flood. All right. So he begats Abram, Nahor, and Haran. All right. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran begat Lot. So Lot is Abram's nephew. And Haran died before his father in Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur the Chaldees. There's where Job is from again. Ur keeps showing up. And Abraham and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. All right? Now, he died in Haran. Haran is named after his son Haran. So, he built him a city. So, Abram was already disobedient. He wasn't supposed to take the whole family. Okay? In chapter 12, verse 1, it says, Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. So the things that happened a lot and different things that happened were at least partially a result of Abram's disobedience. Now they had their own disobedience, so they're still responsible. But if you think about that, it's the same way with us. Your sin affects other people. Now they're responsible for what they do, but you still, like it or not, your sin or the things that you do right are going to have an effect on other people. You think of Lot. Lot ends up drunken and committing incest with his daughters, and the daughters, the children from that are Ben-Ami and Moab. And so who are those? The Ammonites and the Moabites. So two of the 5 worst enemies that Israel has for the next 4,000 years are a result of Lot's sin. So, you never know what how your sin is going to affect the whole world. I mean, people are having wars today because of that sin, okay? A third people that they have fighting with, and that most of the terrorists around the world come from, are the Arabs, and they come from Ishmael. Ishmael shouldn't have been born either. God, Abram got tired of waiting on God's promise for the son, and so he went into his concubine, or handmaiden, and made her a concubine. And now the flip side to that is it shows God's grace, because all those people can get saved today. Even though they shouldn't have been born, on an individual basis they can still get saved, and many of them do. So just because sin causes heartache and wreck, God still takes things, and His grace still extends, and it still makes good things happen out of it, and He still gets the glory for it, and He can turn it around. But the idea is your sin still affects others. We talked about the curse of the line of the kings in Jeremiah 22:30. And because of that curse, so Jesus Christ is born of a virgin, and so He is able to sit on the throne. But if you think about it, because of that sin, Israel went into captivity in Babylon. And isn't that lovely? And Joseph, when Mary's great with child, ready to deliver Jesus, there's no room at the inn, right? So she has Jesus basically in a stable. If the inn was full, I imagine the stable was full. So it probably wasn't the cleanest stable ever, with all the animals packed in there and everything. But Joseph should have been the king of Israel. If it wasn't for that sin 600 years earlier, instead of no room at the inn, he'd be like, what do you mean there's no room at the inn? Then everybody get out of the inn because I'm here. I mean, he's supposed to be the king, but what is he? He's a carpenter. No one even knows who he is. Okay. So again, the effects of sin on others. And so our sin affects those around us and affects people. It's going to affect people until Jesus Christ returns. But Abram, Abram, just like anybody else, just like us, doesn't always do everything the way we're supposed to. But in the end of the verse 1, it says, "Unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And so those that bless Abraham will be blessed, and those that curse him will be cursed, and that gets passed on to Isaac, to Jacob, and then to his descendants. So God uses wicked men to punish Israel, but then he punishes them as well. You say, well, why is it fair to punish them? He's using people who are already wicked. So he's, the Calvinists try to say, when Romans says he raised up Pharaoh to destroy him, doesn't mean he created him to destroy him. It says he raised him up for that. Raised him up to what? Raised him up to power. Because he was an idolater and wicked and all that. So he used him to be the one for God to pour out his wrath when he delivered Israel in the Exodus. All right? So, but notice, he's going to give them the land. All right? The end of verse 5 says, "And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land." Why does he keep talking about the Canaanite in the land? Because he's not supposed to be there. "And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And he builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him." All right. So I said that this land, the Hamites were supposed to go. The Canaanites are Hamites. All right. Why do I say that God gave them Africa? All right. Go to go to Psalm 105. Psalm 105 and 106, 3 verses. And they're referring back to the children of Israel being in Egypt. Egypt is in North Africa. In Psalm 106, verse 23, "Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham." Verse 27, "They showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham," talking about the plagues and all that. Psalm 106, verse 22. Verse 21, "They forget God their Savior, which had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and terrible things by the Red Sea." So Egypt is in the land of Ham. And what is Egypt in? It's in Africa. Now you say, well, what about today? I mean, there's not 12 nations, there's like 200, and people are all over the place and they're all mixed up. So it wasn't God's plan. God's plan was to separate people out so that they would seek after God. However, man in his rebellion over the years has made it so it's basically impossible because there's not 12, and people have been all over the world and mixed, and a lot of people have like 30 different nationalities in them, and they could, sort of sometimes people try to use this for a variety of different policies of their own, whether in a church, whether in a government, whatever. It's different around the world on racial relations and different things like that. You'd be hard pressed to try to do this, because what most of the time the way it's applied is black and white, like a mixed marriage, say, for example, just because that's a common one in our country, especially in the last 150 years for that topic. Well, how come it's usually not brought up with black and Asian then? And further, if you're going to go to 12, then the Germanic peoples are clearly different than the Italian, Greek, that part of Europe. You know, because it's not three, it's not just three races, it's 12 nations. So, and are you gonna, and nobody ever complains when a Swedish person marries, you know, an Italian, okay? And then how about further? Asians, well, there's more than one Asian. How many people are gonna bring it up if you have someone from China marrying someone from Laos, okay, or Vietnam? Or if you're gonna go to Africa, we just saw 4 different routes for Africa. Does anybody ever bat an eye if someone from Libya marries someone from Egypt? No. So if you're going to be consistent about it, this is what God did. This is why. But we're already so far from that. You know, it's almost a moot point. And as far as, and plus he's doing it for dividing them up by nation and where they live. So remember Acts 17:26, so that they will, so that they're more likely to seek after God. If you're going to start applying it to marriage, then basically you need to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where the only prohibition is in the Lord. So they're supposed to be saved. Okay, it's supposed to be the only prohibition for a Christian when we're talking about marriage is saved versus lost. Okay, so I mean, if you want, just because I'll be glad to just go through that with anyone after class any time. It's not really for here, but just because it's applied that way so much, and we're talking about the Tower of Babel, I didn't want to ignore it completely. But for a Christian, you know, and you got to be careful, people. You know, you got to be careful about applying verses just the way you want them, because people will go to Galatians and say, well, you know, on one side they'll say, well, there's no more Greek and barbarian, Scythian, and all that. Well, if you're going to use that verse on either side of a marriage issue, then it also says there's neither male nor female. So you're really going to start applying that? You're really going to start applying those verses to that topic just because it says what you want it kind of supports what you want to say? That's where you always got to stay in context and let the Bible say what it says, and you just accept what it says rather than using verses that say, whatever your position on any of these things, you don't want to use verses because they are worded the way you want them to be worded, okay? But that's how he divided it up. That's the reason. And of course, man, ever since then, for the last 4,000 years, has gone against that, okay? All right, so a couple more things and then we'll take a break and we'll come back for Life of Christ. In verse 10, now God just said he was going to give this land to Egypt, land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. Verse 10, and there was a famine in the land. You'll find that a lot of times when God wants to test the Jews, he sends a famine. And they're supposed to dwell in the land. He told them to go to that land. I'm going to give you this land. You're supposed to dwell in this land. So there's a famine in the land. And Abram went down into Egypt. He went back into the world. You know, Egypt's the type of the world. And every time they get in trouble, they go down to Egypt. Okay, famine in the land, go to Egypt. Which is probably why he wasn't in that good a spiritual shape in verse 11. It says, he went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And it came to pass, when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai, his wife, behold now, I know thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that they shall say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, thou art my sister, that it may be well with thee for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee. So, now, throughout history, women want a man who's willing to die for them. How would you I know God says Abraham's a great man, so he was, because God knows it better than I do. And I know him, you know, he lived to be like 9,000 years old, and, you know, I'm judging a few bad days. I get that. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt like I do Job's wife. You know, everybody gives Job's wife a hard time. You know, how'd you like to lose all of your kids in one day and everything you have and get diseased and, you know, or you didn't get diseased, but your husband got diseased. All your kids died, which to me, the possessions don't even matter anymore, but they, you know, maybe they don't think the way I do. Everything they had is gone. All 10 of their kids are dead. And all she did was kind of have a weak moment, you know. And everybody talks about Job's wife like she, you know, like she's a harlot or she's just some, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff about her, you know. Then you got this wife, this Jezebel she wasn't a Jezebel. In fact, Job says, thou speakest as one of the foolish women. So obviously this wasn't her norm. So, you know, I know I'm doing this, I'm slamming Abraham and Isaac a little bit on this, but really? How'd you like to be going into town and your husband says, so, you know, you're really hot and everything, and these people are going to, they're going to watch you, they're going to kill me. So can you say that you're like my sister? Really? And especially, you know, she might have overlooked that, you know. I mean, that's why I think she's the one used it as an example, calling Abraham Lord. I mean, she said that after this. I mean, that's pretty rough, man. That's pretty good submission there. But Lot gets kidnapped a couple chapters later by like mighty armies. And Abraham goes after him with 318 guys, fights Hammurabi and these guys. Like, they had massive armies. Hammurabi, that's no joke. And go in there and rescue Lot. So, you know, not that anyone here would do this, but you know how some people, some women, nobody here, just have an amazing memory when an argument comes up later, like they remember something from 1922 that you said accidentally by mistake you said it wrong, and they will bring it up because they remember, and you'd be like, what on earth? I don't remember that. Not that my wife ever did anything like that. But I saw it on television or something. You know? So, but how'd you like to be in that house? And whenever he tries to say something like, babe, that was a long time ago, you'd be like, you went and rescued Lot. You know, I mean, what? You just took away your only excuse. Well, yes, I know I shouldn't have done it, but there was like 4 million of them, and it was just me and my servants, and they would have killed me. That didn't stop you from attacking the Soviet Empire with 2 guys to rescue your nephew. You know, I mean, so, you know, that house, I would just not want to, you know, you don't want to be there on an argument day because he's just doomed. But that's what he fails the test, ends up in Egypt, and then when it rains it pours, and he goes up there and he starts talking about how she's his wife. And because God protects them from it, Pharaoh, in order to entreat Abraham, verse 6, gives them all these sheep and oxen and asses and men servants, maid servants, and she asses and camels and all this stuff. And so that God takes away the plague from him. So in chapter 13, when Abram leaves, he's wealthy. And Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. And Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. You talk about God's grace. I mean, he just failed, and then he was raggedy husband, and God just made him super wealthy. And so that's where we're going to start out with Abraham. After man failed at the Tower of Babel, God's going to start over with this one nation that he's pulling out from the others. All right, so we'll take a break in 5-10 minutes, like Chinese food or something. And then we'll